According to researchers, the textile industry represents, after the aviation industry, the second largest industrial polluter on a global scale. Why? It is estimated that the textile industry contributes to or produces up to 10% of global carbon dioxide emissions. It is also one of the significant consumers of water, responsible for somewhere up to 20% of global industrial water pollution due to the processing of textiles, such as dyeing. It also produces large amounts of textile waste. We must be aware that textile waste is generated during production, use, and even afterwards. Perhaps, and what is most important for our topic, the textile industry contributes up to 35% of primary microplastics to the pollution of marine environments. The latter is estimated at around 190,000 tons annually. The textile industry and its development have recently offered us a lot of excitement. Since people are rushing towards the development of fast fashion, everyone is striving for it. And the global production of textiles, from 1975 to 2018, has increased almost 2 times, from 6 kilograms of produced textiles per inhabitant per year to 13 kilograms. Although people currently possess considerably more significant quantities of textiles at home, the costs for buying new ones are much lower. It is estimated that in the last 50 years, the buying costs have decreased considerably. As part of this fast fashion, there are also many impulse and rush purchases. Research in the US has shown that people buy new clothes every 5.5 days, so weekly or even more frequently. And even in the European Union, the figures showed that in the last period of the previous 2 or 3 decades, the purchase of clothes increased by as much as 40%. As a result, the usage period of the products has been reduced, somewhere at least by 1/3. Consequently, we make more and more new purchases every year. In Italy, for example, it is estimated that a person buys about 15 kilograms of new textiles annually. In Germany, this figure is 17 kilograms. At the same time, several studies highlight that this issue is the most evident in Great Britain, where the fashion and modern shopping trends and market saturation are extreme. The estimate is that, on average, a person buys almost 27 kilograms of textiles annually. This graph shows how exponentially the production of all textile fibres has increased. We can see at the end of the graph that in recent years, that is since 2010, the growth rate even exceeded the population growth. The dashed line shows how the population has been growing and how the production has been growing by type of individual textile fiber. If we look at cotton or natural fibers, they are present at around 30%, while synthetic textile fibers are about 70%. So, what environmental challenges do we face with this mass production? First, we should highlight the water issue, which is water consumption. Currently, textile production uses more than 40 trillion liters of water annually for irrigation, and most of this water, more than 90%, is associated with cotton production. Let's look at a well-known global example. This is the Aral Sea, which is essentially a very threatened ecosystem. It is estimated that somewhere around 20% of the water lost in this area is precisely the result of excessive irrigation or cotton production in the European Union. Let's look at the example of Cambodia. An example of a country where the textile industry has become the dominant type of industrial production, as much as 60%, that is more than half of the total water pollution in this geographic area and as much as 1/3 of all chemical pollution that Cambodians perceive, comes from the textile industry. The carbon footprint of the textile industry is also one that is very problematic, namely, it has been shown that textiles, in addition to the aluminium industry, are the ones that generate the most greenhouse gases per unit of material. An estimate is that textile production brings up to 10% of greenhouse gas emissions. The energy source used in the production of textiles is also critical. For example, the production of textiles in China depends on energy based on fossil fuels such as coal. As a result, fabrics produced in China have a larger carbon footprint than textiles produced in some European countries where electricity production is not based so much on fossil fuels. The third significant environmental challenge encountered in making textile fibers is using chemicals. In the textile industry, more than 15,000 chemicals are used during production. For example, 6% of the total global output of pesticides is used for growing cotton. However, many of the chemicals used are bound to the fabric, such as some ointments and solvents used in various treatments, whether surfactants, bleaches, softeners, dyes, antifoaming agents and so on. It is estimated that, for example, one European company with finished products uses 460 g of chemicals per kilogram of textile, which is quite a lot. Then, there are also all the means, including gluing, auxiliaries for pre-treatment, processing, dyes, pigments and so on, that must be taken into account. However, we must be aware that approximately 80% of all European textile products come from countries outside the European Union. Therefore, it is challenging to estimate the chemicals content. The problem is also that some textiles labeled as being produced in the European Union are imported as semi-finished textile materials and are then chemically processed locally in Europe. A lot of research has been done in Sweden. As we know, one very important textile plant also operates in Sweden, the one whose stores have a solid global presence. Globally, they have a pretty high market share. More than 2,000 chemicals were identified in Sweden related to the textile industry. The research showed that at least 10% of these chemicals could be claimed or defined as potentially affecting human health negatively. Of particular concern are the various dyes used in the production of textiles, which can act as reprotoxic toxins that hurt human reproduction. At least 5% of the identified chemicals can bioaccumulate, that is, they can accumulate in the tissues of living organisms, which means that the amount of these substances in the organism increases and is also potentiated during the food chain. The fourth environmental challenge is textile waste. A dramatic increase in textile production and the growing popularity of fast fashion lead to increases in the volume of consumption and, naturally, to more significant textile waste. Western countries traditionally export textile waste to developing countries, such as Africa. But what has become of the problem now? This practice is slowly becoming unsustainable with greater production and more significant waste generation. Even many developing countries are already banning the import of textile waste, mainly because, on the one hand, they protect their local production. For example, the markets in Turkey and China are already saturated with used clothes threatening local production. On the other hand, the last environmental challenge we face is worn and tear from washing, maintenance, drying, wearing, and so on. Especially the last three environmental challenges are strongly linked to the creation of microplastics. As a point of interest, another summary of the environmental burdens of cultivation or the production of individual textile fibres is added here. We can see that both synthetic and natural textile fibres are present and in what quantities of their output. We're talking in millions of tons, of course. How much energy is used for these purposes, how much water, and what is the estimated value and contribution to greenhouse gas emissions? When we discuss synthetic textile fibers as waste, we discuss secondary microplastics. When a piece of clothing becomes waste, these larger macroplastic elements can also break down into the environment during fragmentation and degradation under the influence of UV radiation. So we have a lot of such plastic fragmenting into microplastics, but as mentioned earlier, this waste is also created before, during, and after use. Suppose we look at the generation of waste before its use. It is estimated that around 15% of the fabric used in production is thrown away. For example, for jeans, this share is 10%, for underwear or other types of clothing, up to 25%, but on average, 15%. However, let's look at the waste generated after use, which may concern us as consumers the most. Statistically speaking, the average family in the West throws away an average of 30 kilograms of clothes every year, of which only 15% is recycled in the sense that they are given away or handed over to second-hand shops, which are increasingly on the rise. Otherwise, the clothes go directly to landfills or incineration. As already mentioned, Sweden has a fascinating example of the most famous textile manufacturer, which burns their waste clothes in a power plant instead of coal. This is an example of good practice in reducing fossil fuel consumption. Although the company strives for fast fashion, it still contributes something positive to the environment. It is evident that the textile industry also increasingly contributes to so-called greenwashing, that is, it tries to encourage some activities among consumers that contribute to reducing the generation of textile waste. But if we look at the numbers, synthetic textiles such as nylon are not biodegradable and can take up to 200 years to decompose in the environment. So, these numbers are enormous, and microplastics are also formed when the material breaks down. Despite these high waste figures, the rate of textile recycling after use is somehow not increasing. We still recycle only around 15% of used textiles, which means that, for example, some clothes are recycled into wiping cloths, others into mattress fillings, and some into insulating material. One of the famous examples is the African country of Ghana, or its capital city of Accra, which is known not to provide general waste collection services. It does not have a solid waste disposal site of its own, and neither for chemical or hazardous waste. It is therefore facing quite a significant environmental problem, namely on the coast, on the banks of the lagoons of the capital city. There is almost a cliff in the river near the coast, up to 20 meters high, which is a landfill. 60% of this landfill is unwanted, waste clothing. These clothes have been sent to Ghana from Europe, America, and even Australia, in principle for resale or further use, but a large proportion of these clothes are not worn and are discarded. Figures show that around 15 million used clothes arrive in Accra every week from different parts of the world. It is estimated that only about 40% of the clothes are such that they can be used. Here you can see photos of the famous second-hand markets, where they then sell the used clothes, but in numbers, there are unused ones, more and more low-quality waste clothes. Here we see that the problem of the accumulation of waste clothes is extreme. Some studies examine how plastic or microplastics already appear in distant and remote lagoons. This problem will grow more and more over the years unless appropriate measures are not taken. However, this cliff formed is also called the Textile Mountain and is now very recognizable. In comparison, only 1% is recycled in a closed loop, meaning they are recycled into a product of the same or similar quality. It should be emphasized that these practices differ between countries. Germany is said to be very successful in this aspect, where as much as 75% of waste textiles are included through various recycling processes. On the other hand, in Italy, this percentage is only around 11%. Very often, when it comes to the issue of textile waste, we also encounter the political, economic and social status of the country, meaning that they do not have proper handling and management of waste, neither of hazardous waste and chemicals.